Hi, my name is Bella, and my favorite book series is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I am super excited about the new prequel that comes out very, very, very soon. At the time of this recording, in less than a week. It's called Sunrise on the Reaping, and it's going to focus on Haymitch's Hunger Games. So, to prepare for that book and also just get excited about the Hunger Games, I've been rereading all of the books in the series and sharing my thoughts with you here on YouTube. I already finished my reread of all of the Hunger Games original trilogy, so The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay, and if you want to hear my thoughts on those books, you can find the videos already uploaded. But now it is time for the first prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'm really excited to revisit this book because I've only read it once, which is different than my experience with the trilogy that I've read multiple times. So yeah, let's reread it. I'm gonna do this reread the same way that I did all of my rereads for the trilogy books. So I will read this book one part at a time. So I'll read part one, pause, share my thoughts, and then go on to part two. And then when I get to the very end of the book, I will share my thoughts on the book as a whole. My plan is to share my thoughts on major themes or noticeable moments or just anything that sticks out to me in each part. So I'm not specifically setting out to give a full plot summary of this book. So just a heads up. But since I'm going to talk about important moments that I'm noticing, there will definitely be a lot of plot in this video. So with that said, spoilers. There will be spoilers. I'm going to talk, this will be a deep dive on my thoughts on this book. So definitely watch out for spoilers for the entire book. I will definitely reference the Hunger Games trilogy while talking about this prequel. So if you haven't read the trilogy yet, if you're watching out for spoilers for that, just a heads up, there will be spoilers for the trilogy in this video. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's start reading part one. I'm taking lots of notes, as always. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes takes place about 64 years before the events or the beginning of the Hunger Games trilogy. This follows the events of the 10th annual Hunger Games. So it's 10 years after the war ended, but 64 years before the Hunger Games. So that's sort of where we are in time. The main character of this book is Coriolanus Snow, who we know from the Hunger Games trilogy. He eventually goes on to be President Snow, but at the time of the beginning of this book, he is just 18 years old. So he's not in politics yet. Part one of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is called The Mentor, and we pick up actually fun comparison to the first book, The Hunger Games. We pick up on the morning of the reaping, but instead of being in the districts watching Katniss and her sister attend the reaping as someone who could and does be reaped for the Hunger Games, we are watching Coriolanus Snow get ready and then go to the academy where he's a student to watch all of the reapings, because in the capital they're able to watch the reapings as they happen throughout the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. So we start on the morning of the reaping and we go all the way to a few days later. I think it's maybe a week or a week and a half, maybe 7 to 10, I don't know exactly, days later, where we have the tributes in the capital, we have the academy mentors, and the tributes and mentors go into the arena where the Hunger Games will be held, and then there are bombs that explode. The capital mentors are treated in the hospital if they need to. The tributes are treated by a veterinarian, which is kind of yikes. And then a few days after everyone is healed up a bit or not, the mentors and tributes have another interview before the games start. And it's not clear exactly how soon the games are going to start after that, but I think the vibe is like the games will probably start in the next few days. And like the very last thing that happens in part one is that Lucy Greybeard, who is Coriolanus's tribute that he is a mentor to, she says to him that he should start thinking that she could actually win the games. And that's where part one ends. So, plot wise, there is definitely a lot that happens in part one. We have this whole week between the Reapings and the Hunger Games starting, which like they haven't even started yet, where the tributes come into the capital. We're seeing Coriolanus and the other Academy students mentor them. They interview them. They're getting to know them better. They're also working on like the reason that the Academy students are working with the tributes is for a school project where Dr. Gall, who is the head game maker, has basically tasked these Academy students who are 18. This is their like final project before they graduate the Academy. She's tasked them with figuring out a way to get capital citizens, and I think citizens everywhere, but I think they're focused on the capital, to actually watch the Hunger Games. So it's kind of interesting because the Hunger Games in this book seem vastly different than the Hunger Games that we see 64 years later in the Hunger Games trilogy. At this point, the Hunger Games are not something that people are particularly excited about. Obviously, in the district, people dislike the Hunger Games because they have to send their children to die. That's pretty fair. But in the capital, even, it's like in this part of the book, we learn that capital citizens do not like the Hunger Games because they don't actually like to be reminded of the war. Because at this point, most of the people in the capital did live through the war, and it was a challenging time for them where they didn't have food, they didn't have access to resources, a lot of people died, and they had to live through like bombing. So it wasn't a fun time, of course. And so the capital citizens are not thrilled about the Hunger Games because they don't want to think about the war. It's like not fun or entertaining for them. So that is in huge contrast to the Hunger Games that we see in the trilogy, where the capital citizens are incredibly excited. People are like, it's a huge, the jobs related to the Hunger Games, like stylists and prep teams and game makers, are all like really respected and like highly valued jobs. And like everyone in the capital tunes in, tons of people bet on the Hunger Games, and that's just not what the Hunger Games are at this stage, which is very interesting. Anyways, yeah, plot wise, we see a lot happen with the mentors and the tributes. But I have a couple of like main things that I want to talk about in terms of like thoughts or themes or things going on in part one. So the first one is the games themselves, which I actually already just talked about. But it is super interesting to see how different the opinion is of the games and how like they are not interesting to anyone, not the district and also not the capital citizens. We also learn a little bit about how the Hunger Games work right now. And this is also important to point out because it is, of course, super different than the Hunger Games in the trilogy. So instead of like from the Hunger Games trilogy, after the reaping, tributes come to the capital on these like fancy, at least the experience that we see from Katniss, so we assume it's the same for all tributes. Tributes come to the capital on like a super fancy train. They get tons of food. They get a bunch of like they get anything that they would want basically. They have these like beautiful quarters in the training center where they live for the like week leading up to the Hunger Games. They have stylists and prep teams to make them beautiful. They have like an on TV interview, and they are treated, I mean, it's not that they're treated well because in a lot of ways, like they're just kind of treated as like puppets or toys, but they are given like food and all of this stuff. Like they're given food and they're made comfortable, which is very different than what we see happen with the tributes in this book. So at the 10th Hunger Games, we know that after the reapings, the tributes are brought to the capital in livestock cars that aren't even very clean. Coriolanus is at the train station when the tributes arrive, and he says that the livestock cars like smell like manure. The tributes are also kept in the capital zoo in the monkey house. So it's like a zoo enclosure that used to house monkeys but is now empty, which is really kind of awful to think about. And the Capitol doesn't feed them at all. I think it's mentioned that in previous years, the tributes would arrive at the Capitol and then literally the next morning go into the arena for the Hunger Games. So I guess that's a reason to not need to feed them in the past. But in this year, the tributes are held at the zoo for a couple of days, and they have this like time with the mentors before the Hunger Games are meant to start. And the Capitol still has no plans of feeding them. They're very much like treated as criminals. They're held as hostages. They're like, it's not great the way that they're treated, the way that tributes are treated in the Hunger Games trilogy, where they're just toys and pawns, but like this is really inhumane. So yeah. And that's everything that we've seen so far with the tributes because the Hunger Games haven't actually started yet, but that'll be next. And then the other big thing related to the games that I also already mentioned is that because they have really low viewership and interest in the Capitol, Dr. Gall, the head game maker, has set a task for the Academy students to come up with a way to get the Capitol engaged in the Hunger Games. So again, that's where the mentors come in. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in 1 second while I talk about the next major thing that I wanted to discuss, which isn't a thing, it's a person. Coriolanus Snow. Coriolanus Snow is our main character in this book, and he's the only character who we know like what he's thinking, and you know, we're getting this story, even though this book is written in third person, we're getting the story from his perspective. Also, a thing that I meant to mention earlier when I was doing my spiel about this book, I think it is very interesting, and someone actually pointed this out to me before I started my reread, so I've been thinking about it for a while. I think it's super interesting that the Hunger Games trilogy was all written in first person, so we're literally like getting the story from Katniss's voice, but this book is written in third person, and I'm not totally sure why that change was made or like why that decision was made, but I think it works really well. But it is just interesting to think about that being a difference in this book versus the trilogy. Okay, anyways, back to Snow. We learn a ton about Coriolanus Snow in part one. I think a lot of part one is just like getting to know Coriolanus. We see through like his actions and the way that he interacts with people and really what he's thinking that he is very like calculated. And he cares a lot about the way that people perceive him. He cares a lot about being perceived as wealthy and like having a bunch of control on his emotions at all times. And it's interesting, like pretty much every time something significant or potentially emotional happens to him, we get this like inner thought in the book from him that is like, I have to make sure that I like looked okay, that I didn't look like I was scared, that I didn't look upset. And like anytime we get him looking at footage that was taken of him when he's like with his tribute Lucy Gray or just anywhere where there were cameras, he is like taking stock of like, did I look like I was scared? Did I look like I was shaking? Could you tell I was shaking? Could you tell? And he, like, it's very interesting. We see just how much effort he puts into his appearance and how people perceive him. We also learned that Coriolanus has been through a lot and that he and his family are not in a super awesome position right now, at least as Capitol citizens. So Coriolanus is a Snow, and previously the Snows had been a very like wealthy, highly respected family in the Capitol, but now they are dirt poor, basically. So we learn in part one that Capitol families often have wealth because they invest in something in the districts. We know that Coriolanus has a friend whose family invests in like luxury vacation homes in other districts, which is kind of wild to think about. And it feels like that's not a thing later in Panem, but like, anyways, the Snow family had invested their fortune or gotten their wealth by investing in District 13, in munitions and weapons in District 13. But we know the war ends with District 13 being completely destroyed. So their investment there is gone. They've essentially lost all of their money because District 13 is gone. So that's a very interesting position. We also learned that Coriolanus was 5 years old at the beginning of the war, so he has a pretty he has like a few years of memories from when he was a very little kid before the war, and those memories are filled with both of his parents and a lot of money and access and like seeing the circus and all of this like very, luxury things. He even talks about how there is the arena where the Hunger Games are held used to be like a sports arena where like sporting events and circus and all these kind of things were held. And his family was like, there's like a main entrance with turnstiles where regular capital citizens would enter, but his family was so wealthy that they would go in a separate entrance to access their like box seat. So that's what his memories of are from when he's a very young child. But then during the war, we know that he lived through bombings. So the rebels bombed the capital, and so he and other capital citizens lived through that or didn't, but he lived through that. And he says he has a lot of, we know that he has memories of he and his cousin Tigress, who is 3 years older than him, living through these bombs and that being really scary and pretty traumatic. Also, fun tie in, we meet Tigress in the very end of the Hunger Games trilogy in Mockingjay. So it's very cool to have her as a character in this book. We also know that during and then also after the war, Snow has had a difficult relationship with food. And I think this is also very cool to see such a focus in this part when compared with the first Hunger Games book, where we hear so much about how important access to food is to Katniss and how there are so many people in District 12 who don't have access to food. And that's like a big focus is like hunger and starvation and access to food. And that is a big focus for Coriolanus as well. So during the war that Coriolanus survived, similar to the war that we witness in Mockingjay, the rebels cut off the capital's access to like stuff coming in from districts, and the capital is pretty reliant on imports from the districts. So in the war that Coriolanus lived through, the capital citizens are like they kind of lose access to food because of the rebels cutting them off. So Coriolanus, during the war, he and his family did not have a lot of food. He talks about the only reason that they survived and didn't have to turn to really horrific methods of getting food is that in the earlier parts of the war, while they still had some access to food, like they were still pretty regularly getting food, but there were just occasional, like, oh, there's no, there's not this one ingredient, but everything else were good. His grandmother, who they call Grandmam, had the foresight to buy like a ton of cans of beans. I don't remember the type of beans, but they are mentioned. But she basically, through like a black market seller, she knows someone who is selling food. And she goes to him and is like, what do you have? Do you have food that we can buy? I think she's looking for something else, but he basically says like, I've got beans. Do you want them? And she says, how many can you spare? And then they end up getting this like massive delivery basically of beans. And because she got that still towards the beginning-ish of the war, or beginning of the shortages, they kind of lived on those beans through the war, it sounds like. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, so during the war, not as much access to food. But then after the war, the Snows basically lost their fortune. So Coriolanus still doesn't have a lot of access to food, not because it's not available in the capital, but because they can't afford it. So food is once again a really big focus in the beginning of this book, which is very cool to see, I think. Related to food, we also know that Snow and Tigress witnessed people, their neighbors basically, in because of such extreme starvation in the capital during the war, their neighbors cannibalized their other neighbors, and Snow and Tigress like witnessed people, at least one person doing this in the street. Like, yeah, I'm not gonna, it's kind of a graphic scene that is a little bit off-putting, so I'm not gonna say more. But that moment of like such a horrific and just awful act that a capital citizen did in extreme desperation really sticks out to Snow. And he's very grateful that his family never had to do that. And he kind of, but yeah, it's a thing that really sticks out in his memory. Another major hardship that Snow lived through is the loss of both of his parents. So both of his parents died during the war. His father went to fight in the war, and it sounds like he was a very respected person in the capital. Coriolanus really looked up to him. He went to fight in the war and then died. He was shot by rebels. And that was a huge loss for Coriolanus. But an even bigger loss for Coriolanus was the death of his mother, who also dies during the war, but she dies in labor with a child that would have been Coriolanus's little sister, but the child doesn't survive either. So basically, she goes into labor, but it's during like an air raid something. So they're not able to go out and get a doctor or have a doctor come to them, and so she dies. And that's another scene that is described pretty graphically, and I think is pretty tough to read, and is another scene that really sticks out in Coriolanus's memory. He also had a pretty close relationship with his mother, and so this loss really impacts him. And we see him throughout part one going to his mother had like an old powder compact with this like rose scented powder, and when he is stressed or in distress, he will go to that compact and smell it to remember her and sort of calm down. So that was also a huge loss for him. So now Coriolanus lives with his grandmother, grandmam, and his cousin Tigris. But yeah, he lost both of his parents. And I think this combination of, you know, losing wealth, losing his parents, not having access to food, all really impacted him. And a lot of these are really challenging things for him to go through. But it's then interesting to see the way that he deals with all of this, which is by trying to kind of keep it all under wraps and pretend like he's totally fine. So he never wants anyone to know that he doesn't have access to food at home. He like tries really hard to make sure that everyone thinks that he's still super wealthy. He doesn't show his emotions. All of this, like I mentioned earlier. But it's interesting to see this contrast of like he's been through some really traumatic times and he refuses to show that. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Snow's motivations and the way that he acts or the things that he wants in part one and what we're seeing so far in part one. Like I've mentioned a lot, he really values like, you know, being perceived as wealthy and powerful and charismatic and all of this stuff. But we also learn that like he has ambitions of having a really good job in the capital after he graduates the academy. We know that the academy is free, but that his next step towards this great career would be to go to university, and that costs money. And as of right now, he cannot afford university. So there is something called the Academy Prize, I think, which is basically a like cash award given to top students of the academy upon graduation. And Coriolanus really wants to get this because it could be his ticket to going to university. Basically, without it, he has no chance of affording university, but with it, he could hopefully probably afford university. So he really needs the Academy Prize. It's not 100% clear who decides who is awarded it or like how that is given. But Coriolanus knows that his grades are super important. So he's like the top or one of the top students. And then when this mentor project comes into play, again, the academy students that are about to graduate, including Coriolanus, are given this project to be mentors. Each one is a mentor to one tribute in the Hunger Games. And their task is to get more capital citizens to engage with and watch the Hunger Games. When he's given this project, he sort of sees it as his ticket to get the Academy Prize. And so he's like all in. Like he treats this project as like his lifeline. Like this is his one chance to being able to go to university. And so that's particularly interesting because I think that colors all of his actions with respect to his tribute, Lucy Greybeard. We see him be very kind and compassionate to her. We see him try to get her food and like try to get her time on the camera. And we see him put himself in pretty dangerous situations to help her. And like, if you don't know this secret motivation, if you don't know about this Academy Prize and his situation, like, you could take that as meaning one thing, but I think in reality, it's just he's like clawing onto anything that he can find to get him continued access in the capital. So I think it's selfish. But it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see his motivations and to consider his motivations. I think that'll continue to be interesting as we go through the rest of this book. Another interaction or like set of interactions that I think is really interesting to analyze with Coriolanus is the way that he interacts with his fellow classmates, who like could be his friends, but I think he doesn't really see them as his friends. And there are a couple of different interactions, or there are a couple of different moments where we get to hear what he thinks about his fellow classmates. And like his classmate Arachne, when she dies, he thinks that she sort of like had it coming. And he has a lot of not so nice thoughts about her that he keeps to himself, of course, but like he does not think very highly of her. Another big like interaction, or a really set of interactions, but another student that is really interesting to see how Coriolanus treats them is his fellow classmate Sejanus, who Sejanus Plinth, he and his family used to be citizens of District 2, but then his father became super wealthy by war profiteering. Since they were in District 2, they had some amount of access to like munitions and weapons. I mean, I think they must have been very high in District 2, but basically they got super wealthy by selling all of this like all of these weapons to the capital, and they became so wealthy that they were able to move to the capital, which I think that's the only instance of this happening that we've seen in any of the Hunger Games books. It must have been like a massive amount of wealth, and a huge like driving piece in the success of the capital winning the war. But yeah, the Plinths moved to the capital, and then like the main thing that his father wants is for Sejanus to go to school at the academy. So Sejanus and Coriolanus are classmates, and Coriolanus really looks down on him, again, internally. Outwardly, he's very kind to him. There's even a moment sometime in this section of the book where Coriolanus is like, with like disliked or unpopular kids, you can just be a little bit nice to them and they'll think you're great. Like, it goes a long way. So he's pretty manipulative. But anyways, internally, he thinks that Sejanus is like lower than him because he's from the districts, not from the capital. He really does not have good things to think about Sejanus. And there's this one moment that really stuck out to me, which is when Coriolanus is the first one to visit the tributes. He shows up when the tributes arrive by train to the capital. He gets into the like transport vehicle with them and winds up inside of the monkey cage with the tributes, which was kind of unintentional, but did happen. So he's the first of the mentors to see the tributes, to visit them. But then I think later that night or the next day, he comes back again, and Sejanus is there also, and Sejanus brings like a backpack full of sandwiches and plums and is trying to feed all of the tributes because he knows that they haven't been fed. And Coriolanus is sort of like, what the heck? Like, visiting the tributes was my thing, and now Sejanus is one-upping me by bringing food, which is something that I can't do because I don't have money or access to get food. So it was sort of interesting that like, he's very competitive. I think that moment really solidified for me how Coriolanus sees all of his classmates as a threat to him and as competition, because he needs that Academy Prize, and all of them are an obstacle to him getting it, including the people that he pretends to be nice to or the people that are nice to him. I think he sees them all as threats. So Yeah, very interesting dynamics with Coriolanus and really everyone around him. And then that was all of the like major things that I wanted to say about Snow. There are some like small things that I wanted to mention. We start seeing this phrase in this part of the book that is snow lands on top, and it seems to be a phrase that Tigris and Coriolanus use back and forth with one another if they are like if they're feeling down about their situation as a reminder that like things will work out, that they will always end up on top. And yeah, it's just an interesting phrase. We're just seeing it used every now and then so far, but I think it's an interesting one. And then also, Coriolanus is actually called a rebel 2 times in part 1, which I just thought was interesting. So the first time we hear it is when Coriolanus shows up to visit Lucy Gray Baird, again, who is his tribute, which I don't know exactly which visit this is or whatever. I think it might be the first one. But they have this exchange where, like, I think Lucy Gray says, like, did they tell you you could visit me? And Snow says something like, they didn't tell me I couldn't, or something like that. But then Lucy Gray calls him a rebel, which is just interesting. It's an interesting little moment. And then later, Coriolanus is trying to like comfort Sejanus at the academy. They are at school having a meal, and Sejanus is not feeling great. And he says he can't finish the food on his plate, but like that's not, I guess that's looked down on. And Coriolanus is like, here, I'll, put it here. And he puts his napkin out and has Sejanus put all of the food in his napkin. And this is against the rules. There's no taking of food outside of the academy, like cafeteria or whatever it's called. And so Sejanus calls Coriolanus a rebel for stealing the food. And both of these instances are like kind of jokey, but I just think it's interesting. I just think it's very interesting seeing that word used for him. It's just, those moments just stuck out to me. Anyways, those were kind of the main thoughts and themes that I had on part 1. The last thing that I'll talk about a little bit is, of course, our songbird in this book, Lucy Gray Baird, who is Coriolanus's tribute. She's the girl tribute from District 12, and we learn a little bit about her in part 1. So 1, she is an entertainer. She describes herself as not really part of District 12, but of the like Covey kind of group, which was previously a traveling band of entertainers and performers. But it sounds like since the war, the peacekeepers have forced them to stay in District 12. We see her sing 2 times in part 1. We see her sing first at the reaping, and then we see her sing again while she's like in the zoo monkey house cage. And we expect to see her sing more. She's really good at singing, and her singing has really caught the attention of the Capitol. She is relatively small and doesn't look super strong, but I think she's the most, like as of part 1, she is probably the most watched tribute. Like she has the attention of the Capitol more than the other tributes because of her singing and her like, I don't know, charisma. She also has like a very rainbowy, ruffly dress that people describe as being kind of circus-y. And all of her interactions are very performance driven. So she's a super interesting character. We see a bit of her, but it'll be really cool to see more of her in the rest of the book. There's a quote at the very beginning of the book that I wanted to point out because I thought it was very interesting. And it's that, quote, "A tendency toward obsession was hardwired into his brain and would likely be his undoing if he couldn't learn to outsmart it." And that is about Coriolanus. And I just think it's very cool to see that with how we know President Snow ultimately ends in Mockingjay. I just thought that was a cool quote. And then a little piece of lore that we learn in this part about the Hunger Games is that the Dean Casca Highbottom, actually created the Hunger Games. But we also know that now he is addicted to morphling and does not seem like a super happy person. So that's like interesting. We also learned that the current president is President Ravenstill, who is a military leader, and that the current head game maker is Dr. Gall, who seems really scary. And a moment like a thing that really stuck out to me with Dr. Gall is that Coriolanus is in her lab at one point. I think when he and his classmate are called there about his like the proposal that he wrote. And as he's trying to leave, he sees a glass case full of human avoxes that have animal parts on their body. So Dr. Gall is like experimenting with human avoxes. Yeah, and I think that's really important to point out. I think Dr. Gall seems like totally heartless, absolutely zero empathy, and really, really, really scary and also pretty unhinged. But yeah, she's definitely an interesting player that Coriolanus is like kind of, not that he wants to, but he's getting kind of closer to her as he becomes or tries to become more successful with this whole mentor project. So anyways, those are all my thoughts on part one. Part one is a lot of like learning about the Capitol, the current Hunger Games situation, everything that we've got going on. It's a lot of like setting the stage. So I'm very interested to see what happens in part two. So see you soon for part two. Part two is called The Prize. We pick up right where we left off in part one, of course, where Coriolanus and Lucy Gray are having their like mentor tribute interview conversation. And Lucy Gray says, like, start thinking I can actually win. And yeah, that's where we start. And Coriolanus has this like internal thought moment of like, oh, right, yeah, I actually like up until now, my strategy hasn't really been about Lucy Gray winning. It's been about like me getting recognition. And they have this moment of like, yes, let's make a strategy together. Like, we'll make you win. We start there and we go all the way to the very end of the Hunger Games and Lucy Gray winning the Hunger Games. And then we have like literally one or maybe two paragraphs of Coriolanus being called to like one of the like teacher offices in the academy. I don't remember who. I think it might be like the dean wants to talk to him, Dean Highbottom. And he goes into the office and is presented with like 3 pieces of evidence of him cheating: an academy napkin stained with grape punch, his mother's silver compact, and a dingy white handkerchief. And so I think like the academy napkin proves that he stole food out of the academy, which is against the rules. His mother's silver compact is something that he gave to Lucy Gray, and also they probably found evidence of poison in it. And then the dingy white handkerchief is probably what they found in the like snake container. So all 3 of those objects prove that he cheated or like broke some rules, and that probably did contribute to Lucy Gray winning. So he is punished, and his punishment is to join the peacekeepers. And that is where we end part 2. Plot-wise, part 2 is largely the Hunger Games. So shortly after the beginning of part 2, where we have the conversation with Coriolanus and Lucy Gray, the 10th Hunger Games do finally begin after being like delayed for quite some time. In this section, we get a lot of information about what's happening in the games. We learn how Lucy Gray wins. We learn how every tribute dies. And I think like a critical piece there is that Lucy Gray wins. Part of it is luck. A lot of the tributes die because like some of them die because they're sick. And then some of the other tributes fight each other while she kind of stays hidden for a long time. Jessup, her ally, unfortunately dies because he has rabies, which he contracted while they were held in the Capitol Zoo. And then ultimately, all of the tributes that Lucy Gray kills, she kills with poison, either from the rat poison that she sneaks in Coriolanus's mom's silver compact, or from the snakes that the game makers put into the arena that are meant to kill everyone, but incidentally don't kill Lucy Gray. Actually, it's not incidentally, it's on purpose because of Coriolanus's kind of cheating action of sneaking a handkerchief with Lucy Gray's smell into the snake container. And we know from part one, because Dr. Gall puts Coriolanus's paper in that same snake container and has this whole moment of like, if the snakes recognize your scent, then they won't hurt you. Like, they're totally cool with you. But if they smell a scent that is unfamiliar to them, they'll attack. So, anyways, Lucy Gray doesn't get killed by the snakes and then does end up using at least one of the snakes as a weapon later in the games. So, that's how she wins: poison and snakes, poisonous snakes, which I do think is quite important. Anyways, we also have plot related to Coriolanus, of course, and all of the other mentors. We have a big piece of plot with Coriolanus and Sejanus, where Sejanus sneaks into the Hunger Games arena and Coriolanus has to pull him out. And we will talk more about that because I do have thoughts on that. But yeah, a lot of the plot is going through the Hunger Games. As always, I have a couple of major thoughts or themes that I wanted to discuss related to part 2 of this book. The first one is actually the general theme that I want to talk about is going to come in the form of a quote from Dean Highbottom. And he says this in chapter 18. He says, "We're all in the arena together." And he says this while doing like an interview with Lucky Flickerman, who is the host of the games, which also, that's a really fun tie-in to the original, like the Hunger Games trilogy, where the host of the games is Caesar Flickerman. So we can assume that they are, like, Caesar is a descendant of Lucky, which is kind of fun. They're talking about how the audience is now an active player in the games. Like Dean Highbottom says, now the audience is an active player in the games. And do you know what that means? And Lucky says, what? And Dean Highbottom says, it means we're all in the arena together, Lucky. And Lucky doesn't quite understand, but I think like that is a huge... I think that idea is a huge piece of this part of the book and also this book as a whole. I think what we're seeing is in this Hunger Games, it's not just about the districts, it's about the capital as well. Something that we've already known from part 1 of this book is that the capital is not super happy about the Hunger Games. Capital citizens don't enjoy watching the Hunger Games. They feel like they actually don't want to relive the war. They don't want the reminder of the war. And even throughout the book so far, through the conversations that we see with the Academy student mentors, some of them don't really... some of them do feel like the Hunger Games are pretty inhumane, which obviously, they are. That's correct. But I think in the Hunger Games trilogy, it doesn't really seem like that's the attitude of capital citizens. It seems like capital citizens are just, it is a game. It is entertainment for them, and they do not see the inhumane part of it. But in this book, it does seem like, we're not seeing the perspective of every single capital citizen, but at least some of these students are really not thrilled with how the Hunger Games work. And they don't think it's fair that these children are treated the way that they're treated. I think in this book and in this Hunger Games, what we're seeing is a shift from the Hunger Games being punishment for the districts, which is what they are described as and what their sort of purpose is initially. We're seeing them change into almost not necessarily punishment for the capital, but I think what it boils down to is a way to keep this conflict alive. And I think the point of that is for control. But basically, I think that and I think that this is something that Dr. Gall specifically is working on, and I'll explain some examples of that. But my perspective is that Dr. Gall and probably other, leaders in the capital know that part of their control over the districts is this sense of punishment for the war. And that kind of only works if the people in the capital still think that the districts need to be punished. And basically, I think that Dr. Gall sees the capital's source of control as this conflict of capital versus districts. And the need for the capital to enforce rules on the districts and be strict, and then, of course, punish the districts. And if capital citizens don't think that the districts need to be punished still, then the capital could lose control of the country, because I think, at least the way that the country's set up now and the way that Dr. Gall sees things, is that all of Panem and the capital's control is rooted in this like punishment and violence and this very strict and like punitive control. So it seems like these Hunger Games are being used as a tool, not just as usual to punish the districts, but to sort of like get the capital back on board with like this conflict. Okay, so there are a couple of moments that I think feed into this idea, but also that feed into this general idea of like the district and the capital all being in the arena together. So one moment that I want to point out that like doesn't directly feed into my theory here, but is important. There's a conversation in one of the like some lecture that Dean Highbottom is holding with Academy students, where some of the students are talking about how like the district kids are very different from capital kids, and it does seem like there's a lot of students who think that. And Dean Highbottom at one point says like, no, district children and capital children are exactly the same, except capital children have like better food and education. But other than that, you're the same. And I think this is just important and interesting to hear, particularly coming from Dean Highbottom. We learned in part one that Dean Highbottom actually invented the Hunger Games. But I think we constantly are getting these little snippets of his opinion, which seems to be that like he's not thrilled with his invention, with his creation. So that's just an interesting thing. Related to my point about this set of Hunger Games being like an instrument to sort of reignite or continue the conflict between the capital and the districts, I think that is part of the role that the mentors are playing in this Hunger Games. It seems like the mentors are like actively part of the Hunger Games. Some of the mentors have literally died. Arachne is killed by her own tribute that she's meant to be mentoring, which, like, again, her death, she was being incredibly unkind and cruel, but like still she's murdered, and she's not a Hunger Games tribute. She's a capital mentor, but she's killed, and that I think is part of the games. Also, several other Academy students are killed from the bombing in the arena that happens before the Hunger Games start, when the tributes and mentors are touring the arena. I think the Ring twins, I think that's how they die. And then Gaius Breen, I think, is another tribute or another mentor who, in the explosion, he loses his legs, but then a few days later he dies from that injury. So these children from the capital, they are not district tributes. They are not in the arena. They are not part of the Hunger Games, but they're dying as part of the games. So even though that's, obviously when they were tasked with being mentors, it wasn't outlined like, here are the risks, but that's still happening. And also all of these deaths happen and the mentor program isn't stopped. Like after Arachne dies, that should have been like, oh, we should stop, but it doesn't. And yeah, I think that's a huge indicator. Then I think maybe the biggest example of these mentor children being part of the games and part of this conflict is when Coriolanus has to rescue or retrieve Sejanus from the arena when he sneaks in. So Sejanus sneaks into the arena after having like kind of an outburst at school, basically about the Hunger Games and the situation in the capital versus the districts. He feels like pretty awful about being at the capital and part of the capital. So he sneaks into the arena and like does a District 2 sort of like funeral ritual type thing over his tribute Marcus's body. Coriolanus actually sees him on TV with his mom, Sejanus's mom. Sejanus's mom comes to Coriolanus's house, trying to see if Coriolanus knows where Sejanus is, but he doesn't. And then they look at the TV and they see like a shadowy figure that definitely doesn't look like specifically Sejanus, but Sejanus's mom is like, that's my kid for sure. Anyways, Coriolanus gets a call, I think either from Dr. Gall or from like someone kind of on behalf of Dr. Gall. And he is tasked with retrieving Sejanus because they are saying that like if they send in peacekeepers, it'll scare Sejanus and he'll just like hide more, and it, you know, there's a risk of him dying and blah blah blah. Honestly, I think overall those are just excuses, and like Dr. Gall wants Coriolanus to go into the arena, and so that's what's going to happen. Coriolanus is so desperate to perform, like we talked about after part one. Coriolanus is in a position right now where like he will do anything to receive the Academy Prize because it's kind of like his only shot at success in the capital. So he is in a position of complete desperation. He will do anything. So Dr. Gall asks him to go into the arena and retrieve Sejanus, and he can't say no, basically. So he does. He shows up at the arena. He gets outfitted in like a thick vest to protect him from weapons. And he goes in. He has a conversation with Sejanus and gets him out. But as they're leaving the arena, other tributes show up and try to attack them. And in fact, one tribute, Bobbin, even does try to kill Coriolanus with a knife, and Coriolanus is able to deflect it. He gets a cut, and then he beats Bobbin with a like piece of wood. Anyways, they get to this area that's like almost the exit of the arena, and Coriolanus, before going in, had been told by the peacekeepers that once they get to that, like almost the exit area, the peacekeepers would be able to provide cover by like shooting at tributes if they show up, or at least like doing some sort of like gunfire to deter tributes. But when they get to that area, that doesn't happen. There's absolutely no shooting. The peacekeepers do nothing. They barely even help getting them out of the arena. So yeah. And right after that, Coriolanus is like reasonably super pissed and is like, what the heck? You said that you would provide cover and you didn't. And one of the peacekeepers says, don't blame me if Gall thinks you're expendable, boy. So the peacekeepers got orders from Dr. Gall to not shoot. And I think that's the moment that Coriolanus sort of realizes that he's a piece in these games. And I think me at least as the reader, that was a big moment where I was like, oh wow, yeah, like Dr. Gall really sees the mentors as part of the games. Which, yeah, I think that was like a really big moment of, oh, they're not just on the outside, they're on the inside as well. And then going back to the original quote in this kind of section, we're all in the arena together. Dean Highbottom isn't talking about how the mentors are like kind of fighting for their lives in some instances. He's talking about how capital citizens are now participating in the games by sending money in like paying money to send food to their favorite tributes in the arena, and then also betting on their favorite tributes. That's another, like, it's a different element of it, but the capital is getting involved in these games. And we also hear this little moment about how there are different, like, there are basically like fans who have like, Coriolanus talks about seeing fans that have like images on their shirts, including images of him. And like, that's huge that capital fans are cheering for their favorite tributes, but they're also cheering for their favorite capital mentors. There's also fans that get in like fights over which tribute they want to win, like when they're watching outside of the arena. Yeah, there's a lot of different instances of ways that the capital is more excited about these games, and I think ultimately that means like closer and more involved. Shortly after the whole Sejanus and Coriolanus going into the arena, Coriolanus has a conversation with Dr. Gall basically about that, and Dr. Gall reveals that like she wanted Coriolanus to be in the arena and to experience what he experienced. She also reveals that Bobbin, the tribute that Coriolanus like hit with a board, is dead, that he killed him. And basically, like, Dr. Gall, I think Dr. Gall wanted that to happen. Um, and it's just kind of icky to think about the way that she's manipulated Coriolanus. I think also it shows that, like, I think Dr. Gall also would have been okay with the tributes killing Sejanus or Coriolanus, because that would be another reason for the capital to be angry at the districts. It would be like another part of this conflict. Dr. Gall talks about how, like, you know, what are your thoughts on what happened? Because the tributes tried to kill you, Coriolanus, even though there's no reason for them to. Like, you're not part of the Hunger Games, so they don't need to kill you, but they tried to anyways. And I think she's trying to plant the seed of, like, right, aren't the districts bad? Don't you hate the districts? But then also, it's not even just that. I think she has this line of, like, she says that she thinks of the arena as, quote, humanity undressed. And she talks about how, like, as soon as you're in the arena and, like, you're fighting for your life, all sense of civility and like what and law, I guess, and justice is gone. And people, including Coriolanus, people turn into these monsters that are willing to kill people for their own survival or for, you know, who knows what. So it's really, yeah, it's a very icky, but also very interesting conversation. I think in addition to the way that Coriolanus is sort of manipulated into going into the arena, this conversation afterwards is also a huge clarifying moment of, like, what Dr. Gall's intentions are and what actually is going on with these games. Dr. Gall also specifically asks Coriolanus, like, how he felt in the arena, and he says, quote, "I wanted them dead. I wanted every one of them dead." And I think it is, like, I think this entire book, there really hasn't been a moment where Coriolanus has been, like, a good person. Or at least, you know, if, like, good to bad is a spectrum, he's not closer to good. You know, he's only 18 during this book, so in some ways he's still kind of a kid. He's been through a lot of horrific things in the war. But it's sort of like, I feel like what we're seeing with these interactions with Dr. Gall is her pulling him closer to bad and pulling him, like, kind of trying to get him to reveal the truth about himself, which is that he's kind of evil. But, like, she's an adult and he's still so young. So is that her revealing his true self, or is it her manipulating him into being evil? I don't know. Probably a little bit of both, but it's really interesting to see the way that Dr. Gall manipulates and kind of plays Coriolanus. So the last kind of point that I wanted to bring up or mention in this whole, like, we're all in the arena together moment is that the capital and the districts, or the capital capital citizens still see themselves as very different from the districts. Despite, you know, the realities and the thing that Dean Highbottom said, like, capital citizens want to see the district citizens as, like, lesser and them as better. And the games do kind of play into that. And one of Coriolanus's strategies in getting more of the capital audience to favor Lucy Gray has been to paint her as not part of the districts, but as some other thing that is more like the capital than it is like the districts. And I just think that that's interesting, and it's interesting that that's a strategy that works. I just think that, like, everything in this part about what's happening to the capital and the mentors and the capital citizens is so interesting, because I think Coriolanus is being played by Dr. Gall, but also kind of all of the capital is being manipulated by Dr. Gall and these Hunger Games into, you know, reviving a conflict that they might not have cared about as much anymore, that they were ready to just kind of put to bed. It's just very interesting to see this kind of, like, political manipulation. The next kind of general thought that I wanted to talk about, and it's pretty related to the last thing that I talked about, is the role of mentors in this Hunger Games. And I think it's very tied to all of the stuff that I just talked about. The mentors are sort of a way to bring the capital back into this conflict and reignite this conflict. Not that the conflict is dead, but it does seem like capital people are like, let's forget about the war. And the mentors are literally being harmed in this Hunger Games. They were bombed by the rebels, probably. They have been killed by the district tributes. Like the mentors are part of the games, and that brings the capital back in. But also, and I think this is something that I already mentioned, but I think that it is easier for capital citizens to root for a capital mentor than it is to root for a district tribute, at least at first. I think it's interesting because we know from the Hunger Games trilogy that eventually the mentor role is passed on to former victors. So capital mentors is not a thing that continues, at least by the time we are seeing the Hunger Games, the 74th Hunger Games in the trilogy. But I think like to start to get this thing kicked off, it seems like it is so much easier for capital citizens to get behind their capital kids than the district tributes. And again, the moment that I want to reference is that t-shirt moment where Coriolanus says that there are fans who are rooting for Lucy Gray who have like his image, like his face on their t-shirts because they're rooting for Lucy Gray, but they're also rooting for him. And they're rooting for his tribute. And yeah, that's just an interesting part of the mentor kind of situation and relationship to the games and the capital. Then the last kind of thought that I wanted to discuss on part 2 is Snow's possessiveness of Lucy Gray. And I think this is kind of related to the role of the mentors, where the capital citizens are rooting for Coriolanus and not just Lucy Gray. But we are seeing him, I think Coriolanus has sort of already seen Lucy Gray as his a little bit, like this is not super new. But we're really seeing this ramped up in part 2. One of the first moments, and I think in some ways it has some like romantic vibes, but I think mostly it's just control. And I think any romantic vibes that are in the book are just like part of this larger idea of like control. That's my opinion. I don't think that this is a romantic story. We're not in part 3 yet, but I think it's a story of control. Anyways, so I think one of the first big examples is earlier in part 2, the tributes do an interview show kind of deal. And Lucy Gray goes last and she sings a song, which I really love this song. We get 2 instances of Lucy Gray singing in part 2. The first is the interview song, and it's the song, she introduces it as the Ballad of Lucy Gray Baird, which is very cool. And the second is the song towards the middle/end of the actual Hunger Games. She sings to the snakes to calm them, which is also a very cool moment, but both really cool singing moments. But anyways, the interview song, the ballad, there is reference in it to a lover, like a person who she calls lover, basically. And at the end of her song, Coriolanus is like pissed and super jealous. And it's very interesting because I think his jealousy almost seems like, sure, on one hand, it might sort of be romantic, like maybe he has a crush on her, and so he's jealous that she had a romantic interest previously, but it almost, to me, sort of seems like he's jealous that she had any life to speak of before this moment. Like he is jealous that she has any past experience that wasn't like created and highlighted and shown by him. So it's like partly that he's jealous of this lover thing, but it seems to me like he's more just jealous that she has anything that could be just hers and not something that they created together, which is, I think, a super huge red flag. not good. It doesn't look good. Also, after that super successful interview, there are tons of people that really connected with Lucy Gray and really appreciated her song and feel a lot of maybe not love and maybe not even respect, but like they feel something positive towards her. And Coriolanus keeps hearing like, oh, she did so well, like good job, Lucy Gray, in the interviews. And he is once again like kind of pissed and kind of jealous that she is getting credit and recognition and not him. Like he thinks that he should be getting the credit because Lucy Gray is his tribute. And so it all, comes back to him, it's just another, like, it's so, for me, there are moments throughout this book where I feel a lot of empathy for Coriolanus because he's so manipulated by people around him. And then when you hear him talking about Lucy Gray, it's like, ugh, it's so uncomfortable. Also, when towards the very end of the Hunger Games, when it does seem like there's a possibility of her winning, really, uh, Coriolanus has these daydreams of them kind of like being together after she wins the Hunger Games. But the way that he describes them is, I think, so possessive and problematic, where he's not thinking about like a life they could have together and like shared happiness. He's thinking about how he could get Lucy Gray to move to the capital to be with him and to be his. And it's just all really yikes to read. And then there's one other moment that I think is related to this, but actually kind of reminds me of the Hunger Games trilogy, where towards when Coriolanus he has this like handkerchief that had Lucy Gray's like scent on it, from like maybe wiping her eyes or something like that. And he has that. He puts it in the snake tank so that the snakes know Lucy Gray's scent so that they won't attack her in the arena, because he thinks the snakes might go to the arena, and he's right. He knows as he's doing that he is crossing a line and that is probably cheating, or at the very least like not good. He sort of questions or thinks about his own motives and has this thought of like, if his motivation is because he cares for Lucy Gray and he really doesn't want her to die from these snakes, like maybe that's understandable. But if his motivation is for him to win, for him to have Lucy Gray win the games so that he can win the Academy Prize, or at this point, I think the Plinth Prize maybe has been introduced, that's introduced in part 2. In addition to the Academy Prize, there is the Plinth Prize, which is offered by the Plinth family, where whatever mentor's tribute wins the games, that mentor will receive a full ride scholarship to university from the Plinths. So Coriolanus really wants Lucy Gray to win. Anyways, he has this questioning of like, if my motivation is because I care for her, that's one thing. But if my motivation is to win, then I've definitely just cheated. And it sort of reminds me of the questions of Katniss's motivation with the berries at the very end of her first Hunger Games, where if she brought out the poison berries for her and Peeta to die because she loves him so much, she couldn't handle her going home without him, that's forgivable. But if she brought out the berries as like a rebellion, like to rebel against the capital, then that's, she has broken the rules. She's done something wrong. And this is not quite it's like not the same stakes. It's not the same thing, but I think it's very interesting the way that this is talked, like the way that Coriolanus thinks about this, of like, there's one motivation that's forgivable and one motivation that's not. And that's very interesting. And I think I know what his motivation is, but we will keep reading and see together. So yeah, those are all of my kind of major thoughts, things to talk about in part 2. I had a lot to say. But yeah, I'm gonna go read part 3 now. So thank you for watching/listening, and I will see you for part 3. I finished The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. my notes. Part 3 is called The Peacekeeper, and part 2 ends right after the Hunger Games have finished and Lucy Gray and Coriolanus have won, and Coriolanus is like pulled aside in the academy and like gets in trouble for having cheated and agrees to join the Peacekeepers. At the end of part 2, we don't really know exactly what happened in that conversation. So that's where we pick up in part 3. We get some additional information about that conversation, about why Coriolanus is in trouble. So we know that they show him the napkin from the academy, his mom's like empty powder compact, and a handkerchief. Handkerchief. A handkerchief. A handkerchief. And a handkerchief. So the academy napkin, he's in trouble for stealing food, which is not a massive offense, but like they describe it as like starts off a pattern. His compact had rat poisoning in it, and he and Lucy Gray both said that he didn't put the rat poisoning in it, that he just gave the compact to her as a token of like his affection. And I don't know, that's hard to prove, but that's something. But then the third item, which is the thing that like really gets him in trouble, is the handkerchief that's found in the like container with the snakes. And what's really interesting about this moment is that he almost gets away with it because it's just like a plain white handkerchief. It could be anyone's. And even a lot of the lab assistants in Dr. Gall's lab are like, oh no, like who dropped their handkerchief? Someone dropped their handkerchief. And one of them is like, oh, I lost a handkerchief a few days ago. It's probably mine. But then when they look closely at the handkerchief, it has initials embroidered into it. And the initials are CXS for Crassus Xanthos Snow, which is Coriolanus's father's name. And Xanthos is like such a unique name, probably the only X name, that it's like very damning. It's very obviously his. And then also they test it and they find both Coriolanus's DNA and Lucy Gray's DNA. So he gets in trouble for cheating. We find out that basically he is allowed to join the Peacekeepers instead of having like the public humiliation of being expelled from school and like outed as cheating in the Hunger Games. So the Peacekeepers is like a quiet option of like just leave. And when you sign up for the Peacekeepers, you sign up for a like 20-year agreement. So he will be gone for 20 years. Anyways, we start at that moment and we go all the way through to the very end of the book where Coriolanus and Lucy Gray reunite in District 12 and then they have a falling out. And then Coriolanus leaves District 12 for like elite officer peacekeeper training in District 2. But instead of arriving in District 2, he arrives in the capital and he is brought to Dr. Gall. And Dr. Gall is basically like, surprise, you're studying with me at the university, and this was all just a test, and good job. Those are not the words that she uses, but that's the vibe that I get. And we get the epilogue that's like a few months into his studying at the university. We find out that Coriolanus has an internship with the game makers. We find out that he has been named as the Plinth's heir because Sejanus's parents, the Plinths, are so grateful to him for being such a good friend to Sejanus, their kind of like wayward in their eyes son, that they kind of take him in. And we have the kind of iconic final line of the book, snow lands on top. Part 3 is really interesting because there's a lot of action that happens. It all happens in District 12, which is really, really cool. I think it's really neat to see District 12 and get to compare that to the District 12 that we see in the Hunger Games trilogy of like Katniss's time. Also, so far we've really only been in the capital, so it's just cool to see what life is like in the districts. And we get a lot more time with the Covey band, so we have a lot more music, which is really fun. And I think we also get to like explore more of Coriolanus. I think it's really interesting seeing Coriolanus outside of the capital and outside of that like direct influence of the capital and see like how he behaves and how he's like actually kind of making friends sort of, which before now like he's charismatic and he has like acquaintances, but he doesn't really seem to really value other people, and it almost seems like he's kind of connecting with people in District 12. Yeah, we get to explore a lot more of him. But ultimately, I think it all comes back to Snow being the same person that he always has been, which is really calculating. We'll talk about it. But yeah, as usual, I have a couple of thoughts and themes from part three. The first one that I want to talk about is the idea of order versus chaos. So I think that this starts with the discussions that Coriolanus has with Dr. Gall about like civilization and the importance of the Hunger Games and the role of the capital in governing the country. But now that Coriolanus is in District 12, he's thinking about this a lot more. And he's seeing these snippets of like order versus chaos. Like the first moment is when he goes to Arlo's hanging and he sees like dissent in the crowd when that happens. And he sees that people are like grumbly and mad, but they're not doing anything about it because there are all of these peacekeepers all around them. And they know that they would be in trouble. The one person that kind of like does say something, Lil, is taken by the peacekeepers and in trouble. And then he kind of compares that to a few nights later when he's at the Hob to watch the Covey band play. Billy Tope shows up and sort of like starts a little scuffle. And when the lights go out, everyone's fighting basically. Like there are peacekeepers who are like, you know, off duty and just enjoying the show, but like they are fighting. There are District 12 citizens that are fighting, everyone is fighting. And Coriolanus is thinking about how like when like that makes him nervous because it's a time where he sees people actually push back against order or governance or law or the peacekeepers. And it kind of reinforces this idea of like when like order has to be so strong to hold back chaos. And as soon as there's like a blip in that order, like the lights going down, chaos is right there. Also, I think we see just how much Coriolanus thrives in order. He really appreciates order. Like he does really, really well with the peacekeeper training regimen. He seems to, if not enjoy it, like he's just very, very good at it. He's like decent at shooting. He's good at the physical activity. He really, really benefits from the food. He talks about how he gets more food as a peacekeeper than he did at home, and that's huge. He just seems to like pretty much thrive in that order. Even like he shows up to join like when he first joins the peacekeepers, he's like, oh, the food is like salty. Bleh. And then a few days later, he's like, oh, I actually really like the food. Like he just is kind of thriving, I think, because he does so well in this like order of like exactly what's expected of him and everyone around him. He likes control. He also talks about becoming an officer as an option for another path to influence and power. So now that he's a peacekeeper, he has the option to take the officer exam and then like transition to being an officer instead of just like a peacekeeper, which is like a higher rank basically. And I think it's interesting that like he, shows up, sets up in this new zone of like order and control and immediately is like, yeah, I can do really well here. Like this is gonna work for me. Just interesting. We also have Lucy Gray and the Covey as like an opposite of that. We know that the Covey, before they were like rounded up by peacekeepers and forced to stay in District 12, they used to travel and like they are musicians and artistic, and I think they just give off, they wear a lot of color. They have these like interesting names. I think they give off this air of being pretty chaotic, in I think a really beautiful and cool way. But it's this comparison of like Snow, who really prefers rigid order, versus Lucy Gray, who does not prefer order, and like she is unhappy about being forced to stay in District 12, and like she doesn't like this control over her life. Also, towards the very end of the book, when Lucy Gray and Coriolanus make a plan to run away together and they go out into the woods, and within like a few hours of that plan, Coriolanus is sort of like, oh, I'm gonna hate this. Like he knows that he will not enjoy living out in the wilderness and living away from society. And it's just like he is so capital and society, and Lucy Gray is not. And that's an interesting comparison. The next thought I wanted to talk about is Coriolanus Snow and his loyalty. We have seen multiple times throughout this book, but particularly in part 3, we see Coriolanus betray people that he seems to be or should be loyal to. In part 3, he betrays his kind of only friend, who we know that he doesn't really totally see as a friend, Sejanus. And then we also see him betray Lucy Gray. Yeah. And I think Coriolanus is a loyal person, but I think that his loyalties have like a hierarchical order, and that is the most important thing. Like, I think first and foremost, he is loyal to himself, and then his family, and then the capital, and specifically like powerful entities within the capital, like Dr. Gall and like government and the Hunger Games. And then I think next on his list of loyalties is sort of like the general, what he perceives as like the general order of the world. So like maybe general law, like law in the districts, and the kind of like, I don't know, like that social contract that he talks about with Dr. Gall, like the general social contract of how people should be to one another. And then I think last on the list is his loyalty to like pleasurable things like friendship and even love. I don't know, like I'm not an expert, so I don't know exactly what Coriolanus's loyalties are, but I think that like he will always abandon a friend if it means staying with a loyalty to something else higher on his list, like a family member or the capital. And I think that's what we see in part 3, like when Coriolanus betrays Sejanus by recording him with the Jabberjay, revealing his plan about escaping District 12, and he sends that back to the capital for Dr. Gall. I think Coriolanus feels like he's doing the right thing because he's honoring a loyalty that is bigger than his loyalty to Sejanus, and that is his loyalty to Panem and to the capital. Like, I think that he thinks the best form of loyalty is being loyal to his country. And it's really tough because I think, you know, my perspective as a reader, and I think the perspective maybe we're meant to have as readers, is that like Panem is not the entity to be loyal to. And that like he is being loyal to an entity that is ultimately going to cause him and everyone more pain. But I think he doesn't see that. And I think also like part of the reason I think he wants to be so loyal to Panem is that he thinks it's what's best for his family. Like it's complex. I think I talked about this all the way back in like part 1, like what are Coriolanus's motivations and drives and what does he care about? And I think like this discussing or thinking about his loyalty is the same part of the same conversation. Like he is loyal, he's really loyal to something. It just is like not really what I would what I would consider the right thing or the best thing. I think his loyalty is to Panem, and that's what drives a lot of his actions. And I think beyond just betraying Sejanus and Lucy Gray for the sake of Panem, like again, he betrays Sejanus because he thinks that what Sejanus is doing is a threat to Panem. But I think also in both of these instances, he's betraying these people because they're posing a threat to him. And maybe that's even more important than his loyalty to Panem. I do think that his loyalty to like himself and his status is the most important thing to him. So I think maybe that's also maybe even the main thing that's driving his actions. So in the case of Sejanus, when Sejanus tells Coriolanus about his plans to run away, like Coriolanus knows that everyone knows that Coriolanus and Sejanus are friends, and Coriolanus is probably Sejanus's closest friend. And so I think Coriolanus thinks when this plan is revealed to him that Sejanus is going to like buy weapons, he's going to knock out a peacekeeper, steal someone from the prison, and run away. I think Coriolanus knows like for sure Coriolanus will get in trouble for that because they're friends. And so the peacekeepers will assume that he knows. So either Sejanus like doesn't succeed, and then somehow Coriolanus is wrapped into helping cover for him or help him get out of a bind or something, some issue. Or Sejanus does succeed and he's gone, and then Coriolanus will have to take the fall for him. And either way, it creates more work for Coriolanus and also is a bad look, like will reflect badly on Coriolanus. And so I think like on the one hand, he thinks he's being loyal to Panem, but maybe even bigger than that, probably even bigger than that, he doesn't want Sejanus's actions to reflect badly on him. And I think it's similar with Lucy Gray. When Coriolanus agrees to run away with Lucy Gray, he thinks that that is the best option for him because he knows when Sejanus bought weapons for his escape plan with the rebels, Coriolanus sort of like intercepted that. And because of the situation, Coriolanus shot and killed Mayfair. And Coriolanus knows there's a gun out there somewhere in the world that has his fingerprints on it that will be matched to Mayfair's death. And so he would be accused of murder and probably executed if that was found out. And so because that's like out there in the world, he doesn't know where the gun is. And he knows that at any moment it could be found and that he, like, that's his end, that's his undoing. He thinks that the best option for him is to run away with Lucy Gray. Like, that's kind of his only option to stay alive. But when he finds the gun and he knows that then he can destroy it, so there will be nothing linking him to the murder, suddenly he, like, it's almost like, you know, that list, that hierarchical list of who he's loyal to, it was like grayed out when the gun was out there. And then now that he has the gun, all of those possibilities open up again, and he can be like, he has this officer training that will get him in closer proximity to the capital, that will be better for him and his dreams of power, better for his family. And it's sort of like, oh, this is no longer the best option for me. And in order to remain loyal to Panem and loyal to myself, I have to choose something else. And I think like both betrayals are very interesting, seeing how he rationalizes his actions and what he's thinking. But I think the betrayal of Lucy Gray is so interesting because up until the point that he finds the guns, like you can see Coriolanus being like, yeah, this is the best option for me. Like, you know, this is what's best for me. And like, at least I'll have Lucy Gray and I like her and we're in love. It's going to be good. You know, it's all good. It'll be good. And then he finds the guns and he's like, oh, I would never have been happy in the wilderness with Lucy Gray. This would never have worked out. The best thing for me, I'm an asset to Panem, and the best thing for me to do is go back to destroy the gun, go back and do officer training. Like, it's just interesting seeing his brain work. I feel like you can see it in that moment in particular. What's also very interesting about that moment is that right after he has that realization of like, oh yeah, I just have to destroy the gun and then I can go back. That's what's best. I'll do that. He has that snag of like, the gun actually isn't the only thing that connects him to that murder. There's one other thing, and that thing is Lucy Gray. And it is so interesting and heartbreaking, but really interesting to see him go from pages ago thinking that he's in love with Lucy Gray to shooting at her to kill her, because that's the last loose end. Lucy Gray's the last thing that frees, you know, with her gone, he's free to go back to the capital, hopefully. I mean, at least to go back to to go back to opportunity. But it's just, I love the way this is the final chapter of the book. I love the way that chapter is written. It is so heartbreaking, but I think it really illustrates what's going on in Coriolanus's mind. Yeah. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is Coriolanus and Crassus Snow. So Crassus Snow is Coriolanus's father. He died during the war. He was like a well-respected, I don't know what his title was, but he was in the like peacekeeper army basically, and was killed by rebels. So I think we learn more about Crassus in part 3 through Dean Casca Highbottom. So we learned that Highbottom and Crassus were friends when they were Coriolanus's age. So like around the exact same time in Coriolanus's life when his father was like graduating from the academy, he and Highbottom were the best of friends. We learned that their falling out actually had to do with the Hunger Games. So they had they were both in a class with, it actually might have been, no, I think it was it university? It's possible that this was university, not the academy, but either way, they were in Dr. Gall's class together, and they had a final project to come up with a punishment for your enemy that is like so significant that they'll never forget like what they had done or something like that. It's a very Dr. Gall type assignment, and they are doing it in pairs. And so Highbottom and Crassus Snow are best friends, so they do the project together. And what we find out happens, we find out that that is how Highbottom invented or came up with the idea for the Hunger Games, this project, sort of. But we find out that the details of how that came about are that Crassus Snow got or encouraged Highbottom to get incredibly drunk and then egged this idea on as a joke. And Highbottom thought that he was just describing like a personal joke of this prompt to Crassus Snow, and that it wasn't actually for the project, and he was just like super drunk and talking about like how absurd would this be? This is the most absurd idea. And that Crassus Snow was so driven to get a good grade that he took that he wrote up the assignment with all of Highbottom's ideas and turned it in the next day before Highbottom had a chance to be like, whoa, I was just drunk. That's a joke. And so that, like, Highbottom feels like Crassus was only a friend to him when he could get something from him. And that Crassus really betrayed Dean Highbottom when he submitted that assignment. And I think, like, in that betrayal, we're seeing kind of the exact same behavior as Coriolanus, which is this idea of, like, I will be close to people while I can benefit from them, but I would betray them if it means holding loyalties to something higher than them, like myself. So Crassus betrays Highbottom to get a good grade. And now we are stuck with the Hunger Games, and Dean Highbottom is stuck with the credit for an idea that he pretty clearly resents. So really interesting backstory on Coriolanus's father. We also have Dean Highbottom multiple times in this book comparing Coriolanus to his father. And I think it's because he is seeing this action of, like, be just close enough to people that you can gain their trust and get stuff from them, and then betray them if it means it'll benefit you or something else that you value higher. So super interesting. And then there's this one moment towards the very end of the book that I think is a really interesting, almost like artistic, like, example of Coriolanus becoming more and more like his father. And maybe he already was just like his father, but we're really seeing him be his father in this story. So after Coriolanus is out with Lucy Gray, they stop at the lake on their trip to escape District 12. They stop at the lake. We know that Coriolanus doesn't make it beyond the lake, but they go to the lake. They find the guns, and Coriolanus gets into the lake to, I was going to say drown, but that's not the word, like sink the guns into the bottom of the lake so that they are gone. And he gets into the lake to do that, and then he walks home to District 12, to his, like, peacekeeper unit. We know he is bitten by a snake that Lucy Gray kind of, like, plants to bite him. But he makes it back. His snake bite is not poisonous, thankfully for him. He makes it back. He is, like, wet from the lake, and so he had stuff in his pockets that he brought with him because he thought he was leaving his life behind, basically. So he had some, like, mementos, and some of them are ruined, including his mother's powder. So he has his mother's, like, rose-scented powder that used to be in that compact that she kept, and now it's just, like, in some other container, maybe. And he also had some family photos. And both of those things are destroyed. He says that the rose powder is turned into a paste, and the photos are, like, stuck together and ruined, and he throws them away immediately. But surprised that his father's compass is still intact. And so that's the thing that he keeps. And this is just like, it just makes sense. Like powder and photos would not make it through a lake, but a compass probably would. But I think it's very interesting that there's this moment of him throwing away his family photos, throwing away his mother's, his like what has previously been his most prized possession, his mother's powder that reminds him so much of his mother. He's throwing all of that away, but he's keeping his father's compass. And I think that's that's what's happening to him, right? Is he is abandoning the softer sides of him and embracing a person that is just like his father, that is pretty ruthless, and willing to betray people close to him. So it's very interesting seeing him kind of become his father. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about in part 3 is love. So part 3, we see Lucy Gray and Coriolanus be in love. And in fact, at the very beginning of part 3, we find out from Sejanus when he joins the peacekeepers just after Coriolanus does, that the people in the capital think that if people know that or suspect that Coriolanus cheated, they think that he did it out of love for Lucy Gray. And I think that maybe I'm reading into this too much and maybe I have a pessimistic view. I will admit that I have a pretty pessimistic view of the end of this book. But I almost feel like Sejanus saying that to Coriolanus, it feels like he's planting a seed. Obviously before this, Coriolanus has thought that he might love Lucy Gray or that he has some feelings for him. He's definitely interested in her. But and I think he even has said the word love before, so it's not like this is the thing that makes him think maybe I love her. But I think that it's almost like Coriolanus in that moment feels like maybe he could have the support of the capital in his love for her, and therefore it almost seems like this is the first time that his love for her could be a reasonable thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think it's an interesting exchange, an interesting moment. And we start out part 3 with the capital. Some people in the capital at least think that Coriolanus might have acted the way he did out of love for Lucy Gray. So that's interesting. And then we go on through part 3 with Coriolanus. The first time that Lucy Gray sees Coriolanus when he is at one of her shows, she says that it is possibly the best day of her life. She's thrilled to see him again. They reunite. They have these really sweet moments in the meadow. They go to the lake together and they're very happy. They're kissing a lot. They describe themselves as in love. Lucy Gray even writes a song about Coriolanus where she says that she needs him, loves him, and trusts him. And also Lucy Gray has a conversation with Coriolanus where she says that she values trust over love. And it's hard to know exactly what to think about the love story in this book. And I think that's intentional and okay. My thoughts on Coriolanus and Lucy Gray's love are I don't know. And I think that's all right. I don't have the answers. I don't think the book has super clear answers. And I think that's a fun part of reading this book is that we get to read that however we want. We're all going to have different opinions. But my opinion is that maybe they were in love, but that doesn't matter. And I think that's kind of what happens in the story, right? Is there are moments where it does seem totally reasonable that they could be in love. And also Lucy Gray is maybe 16 or maybe 17. I think she's 16. And Coriolanus is 18. They are still kids. And I think they probably don't have a super strong understanding of what love is, or at least I doubt that Coriolanus does. But Coriolanus and Lucy Gray are both very charismatic and I think very good at putting on a show of an emotion that they want another person to think. And so I think they could genuinely be in love. They could have kind of both almost tricked each other into being in love. Coriolanus could think that he's in love with her because it helps to explain some of his somewhat irrational actions. There are so many options for is this love? What does it mean if it is? What does it mean if it isn't? I don't know. But I think a very interesting part is that at least towards the end of part 3, Lucy Gray reveals to Coriolanus that she trusts him. And I think she reveals it particularly in the song that she writes about Coriolanus, where there's a line about her trusting him and that she has like 23 reasons to trust him or something like that, referencing the 23 other tributes that are dead, but she lived. So kind of talking about how she trusts him because he got her out of the Hunger Games. Like he helped her survive through the Hunger Games. And I think she does trust him, but I think that that trust is so fickle and lost so quickly and then also lost forever. And I think like we see her lose her trust for Coriolanus when they're out in the woods about to escape, and they're talking about death and having killed people. Coriolanus says, like, 3 is enough for me. And Lucy Gray immediately picks up on it and says, who's the third? Who's the third? Because she knows about Bobbin, which is the kid that Coriolanus killed in the arena. And she knows about Mayfair, which is the mayor's daughter, who Coriolanus shot. But she doesn't know of a third. And, like, Coriolanus hesitates and then gives this like fake answer of like, the old me. I killed the old me so that I could be this me. And it's funny reading that because I honestly feel like Coriolanus probably could have been honest-ish about feeling responsible for Sejanus's death. Like I think that he could have said that without revealing that he's the one that betrayed Sejanus, except that already he has said that he thinks that Sejanus is dead because someone betrayed him. And I think if he had just like, there's a world where he could have gotten away with it, but I digress. I think at that moment, Lucy Gray loses her trust in him. I think that is it, or at least puts a significant amount of doubt. And then later when they find the guns and she sees his reaction to the guns, that's it. Her trust is gone. And I think that any amount of love that she might have felt is inconsequential without that trust. And I think that's the most interesting thing in their story. In the epilogue, Coriolanus says something about marriage, where he says if he ever married, he'd choose someone incapable of swaying his heart, and basically says that like he would rather marry someone that he hates because he doesn't like the vulnerability of like caring for someone and loving someone. And I think like maybe he did love her, but that would never have been more important than his drive towards power and access. I don't know. It's just so interesting. I don't know that they ever loved each other, but I don't know that it matters. I don't think love was the most important thing to either of them. So anyways, really, I think that's so interesting. And I love the way that their emotions for one another are explored. And I also think like Coriolanus and Lucy Gray are both people that value themselves really highly and like look out for themselves. And so it's just two interesting people to see interact with one another. Yeah. Anyways, those were all of my thoughts on part 3. Part 3 is the end of the book, so we finished the book. So I will be back in like a second to tell you about all of my thoughts on the whole entire book. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the entire book, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, because we did it. We finished it. First of all, I loved this book. Like I mentioned, I think at the beginning of this video, this is my second time reading the book, my first reread of the book. I read it. I don't think I read it immediately when it was published, but I think I read it a couple months or even a year after it was published. And the first time that I read it, honestly, I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was like incredible. I thought it was good. I liked it just like a little bit less than the trilogy. I liked it, I just didn't like it as much as the trilogy. And I think after rereading it, I think it's because on my first read, I just read it really fast and there was a lot that I missed. I think I didn't read it as like closely as I did on this reread. And there was so much that I just didn't notice the first time that I read it. I think all of these like bigger themes about like politics and power and chaos and control, they kind of went over my head, which is a little surprising after rereading it because they're pretty I think they're pretty obvious, or they were to me in this reread. But maybe that's because I was like reading with an iPad and taking notes and like really thinking hard about this book. And I think the first time I read it, I just was like, "What's the plot? Is there love? I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking." But I read it pretty fast. On reread, I loved this book. I still think I like the trilogy a little bit more, but I think that's just how it's going to be, you know? I loved this book on reread though. I thought the themes were so interesting and so well done. I thought it was really like a really tough and fair kind of analysis of like politics in the world. It was really good. Um, I love all of the characters. I really love everything that we learn about Coriolanus. I love that even though we get so much, we have so much opportunity to empathize with him, like he's still so evil, and like we see that. Sometimes I feel like books that explore evil characters are like, no, they're so good, they're so good. Like don't just forget about the evil stuff. And I like that in this, I feel like we get to explore it all. We get to see just how evil he is, but we also get to see how challenging life has been for him. So it's very interesting. I have just two kind of like things that I wanted to talk about after completing the book. The first is what I think the general theme of the book is. And I wrote, human nature? Are people naturally good or naturally evil? And I do think that that's kind of like I don't know if there's one theme of the book, but if there was one theme, that would be the theme that I picked up on, is this idea of like, what is the actual nature of humans? Are we good or are we evil? And we see two different perspectives. So Snow's perspective, which I think is informed by the horrors that he saw in the war, specifically his neighbor cannibalizing his other neighbor, which really stuck with him. And also the information that he's exposed to through Dr. Gall, because I think this is also Dr. Gall's opinion that she sort of pushes on him. Anyways, the opinion that Snow has is that people at their core, in their nature, are evil, and the only thing keeping people from just devolving into chaos is the capital or government in general. And without an entity like the capital, humans would just destroy one another, and that would be that. And I think Snow thinks this because in this book, Snow sees proof of this in the Hunger Games, of course, through himself. When he is in the Hunger Games and people are coming after them, he kills someone. He kills Bobbin. And, you know, it was self-defense, sure, but he had pepper spray and like a flash bomb thing, and he didn't reach for either of those. He reached for a board and beat Bobbin to death. He hit him once and he was on the ground, and then he hit him more. And I think like that behavior is what Snow thinks how people are. Additionally, the tributes that came after him were trying to kill him, and he wasn't part of the games. They didn't get any advantage in the games for killing him. There was no like Hunger Games reason for them to kill him, but they still came after him to kill him. And I think that that's another, like what he saw in the arena in the Hunger Games, what he saw in the war with his neighbors, all of these sort of boost this opinion that he has, which is that that's people's true nature, is what comes out in these dire times. I think he also kind of confirms this when he's in District 12. The two moments that I mentioned earlier when he's with the peacekeepers, Arlo's hanging, where he sees all of the district citizens behave because there are peacekeepers all around them, compared to the fight at the Hob, where it's dark and no one can tell who's who and everyone's fighting. And I think he sees that as a confirmation of like when the lights are off, when you can't tell what's going on, real human nature comes out and it's violence. So yeah, that's kind of like one side of this argument, is that people are naturally evil, and you know, Snow thinks that's the case, and that the capital is so important because the capital is the only thing keeping humanity from falling apart. And so Snow's perspective, particularly at the end of the book, is that he wants to like he would do kind of anything to keep the Capitol's power and keep the effectiveness of the Hunger Games, because he genuinely believes that's what's like holding humanity together and preventing chaos. And he really values control, and he really, I think, is afraid of chaos. So that's his perspective. And then the other side of this argument is Lucy Gray's opinion, which is that people are naturally good, and when people do evil things, it's because they are forced to. And her perspective, she says something in part 3, something along the lines of like, you know, there are things that I or people do in the Hunger Games that we would have never even considered doing if we'd just been left alone. Lucy Gray owns up to the 3 people that she killed in the Hunger Games, but I think her perspective is the only reason she did any of that is because the Capitol manipulated her into it. That she is not actually an evil person, and that people are not actually evil in their core. They are good, but they can be manipulated into evil. And, you know, her experience absolutely backs that up. I think ultimately the right answer, probably like most things, lies somewhere in between. Like, you know, the reality is that we do see in this book and beyond this book, we see people do acts of evil just because, right? Because that's what they have decided to do, and they weren't manipulated into it. We also see people commit evil for political gain, for social gain, for whatever, for all different kinds of reasons that are, I don't know, like, do you consider that someone was forced into it because of their situation, or is it their nature? I don't know. But also, Snow is not right? Like, Snow is not, there's absolutely no way that Snow is correct that as soon as the lights are off, every single person would devolve into chaos and try to kill one another. Like, that's not right either. But it's very interesting to see this kind of push-pull of these 2 different opinions and like what is true. And what's, I think, very interesting is that like we know that Coriolanus is like totally on one side of this equation. He thinks the absolute extreme about people being evil. And we also know, because we know the Hunger Games trilogy, we know where Coriolanus is headed. He's going to run Panem. He's going to be in charge of the government. And we know that that's the opinion that will lead, like, that will rule Panem. And I think that's super interesting. It's just interesting. Again, I think this is one of these things where like, I don't think there's a clear answer in the book, out of the book, in my brain. Like, I don't know for sure, but this is a really big conversation to have and to consider and to have these characters be struggling with. Anyways, that's kind of my only like theme that I wanted to discuss about the book, but there are some other like fun things in this book that I wanted to mention. One, I think it's very cool, the like tie-ins to the Hunger Games trilogy. I think there are a lot of them, but I also don't think that they're overwhelming. I think they're well placed. And also the tie-ins and explanation to President Snow. One, it's so cool seeing all of the Mockingjays. I really appreciate that and enjoy that. And I think it's really interesting seeing how much Snow hates them, and how he has such a violent reaction to the Mockingjays, which I think makes sense in this book. But it also just like adds a really interesting additional piece to the Hunger Games trilogy, and how wild it is that Katniss becomes this symbol of the Mockingjay, which, you know, Snow has this interesting history with. Also, I love the songs. I think the songs that we get in the book are so cool, and it's super rewarding getting to, like, in particular, the Hanging Tree, getting the backstory on what the Hanging Tree was written about and by whom and all of that is so cool. I think that's so rad. The Hanging Tree is such an important song in the Hunger Games trilogy, and it's really interesting and it's super eerie, and it's a song that I think when you read those books, you're sort of like, what does it mean? Like, what is all this about? And getting to know exactly what it's about is so cool. And it doesn't feel forced. It feels totally natural. It doesn't feel like this, like, you know, forced, let's piece this together. It feels right, and it's really cool. I really liked that. Also, I think that it is particularly interesting that Lucy Gray's kind of mode of killing people is poison. We know at the end of the book that Coriolanus poisons Dean Highbottom with rat poison. And we also know from the trilogy that Coriolanus poisons his enemies or threats to his power. And that's kind of like a strategy that he uses over the next, 60 whatever years. And I think it is very interesting, the idea that like poison is almost inspired by Lucy Gray or a reminder of her, or like she was kind of the source of this tactic that he uses. I just think it's interesting. So the Covey sing the Wordsworth poem Lucy Gray with some alterations to make it make more sense for this world. Although I compared it to the original poem and it's like pretty close, which is very cool. Anyways, the Covey sing that poem as a song called Lucy Gray. And the story is of a young child, Lucy Gray, whose father sends her out into the snow, I think to like retrieve her mother from in town and then walk back home with her or something like that. But she goes out before a snowstorm, and then the snowstorm comes early and she is lost. So her family goes out searching for her, and they see, in this book, they see this deep ravine and think the worst, that she probably fell down the ravine in the snowstorm. But then they see Lucy Gray's footprints in the snow. So they're like, yes, great. She's alive. They follow the footprints and they're following them, and eventually the footprints just stop. They're just gone. And they never find her body. But in the story, even now, people still see Lucy Gray, a child, walking in the woods. And it's a really interesting story. First of all, it's a really cool poem. And like, it was just neat I didn't even notice that connection. I thought that was so cool. But it's so good for this story, because I really feel like, I think we get the vibe that like Lucy Gray is always going to be a thing that haunts Coriolanus Snow. He doesn't know if she's dead, and she's the one thing that could be his downfall. And like, I think by the time we're in the Hunger Games like trilogy, it's been so long that it doesn't matter. But I can imagine him over the next several years of his life just having to live with that in the back of his mind. And it's just a really cool poem to include in the book. It's a really cool source for Lucy Gray's name. It's really, really, really neat. I liked it. I liked that explanation a lot. And I had just missed it on my first read. So that was very cool. That is everything I have to say about the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Like I said, I liked this book so much. It was so fun rereading it. I actually didn't cry at all during this book, and I think it's because there was less. I think the emotions were just like more calculated in this book. Like, Coriolanus is not a super emotional person, and so I was not super emotional about this book. But I will say, after I finished reading it, there were a few moments over the next few hours after finishing where I was like, dang, that's really tough. Reflecting particularly on like Sejanus, like Coriolanus's betrayal of Sejanus, his betrayal of Lucy Gray, the way that Lucy Gray must have been feeling in the woods, the decisions that she made. I don't know. There's a lot of, I think, emotion in this, but it felt a little bit detached from me as I was reading it, which I think I feel like felt right for how Coriolanus is. But I didn't cry. So good job, me. I cried a lot in the trilogy. So anyways, this was super fun to reread. I'm so glad that I took another kind of closer look at this book. It really increased my enjoyment of it. And we only have one more Hunger Games book to read. And as of right now recording this, the book is out today. I think I started recording my reread for Ballad like the week before it came out. So at the beginning of the video, I probably said like, it comes out soon. It's out now. I don't know when this video is going up, but the book will definitely be out already. So I am going to immediately turn off my camera and then start reading the new Hunger Games book, Sunrise on the Reaping. So I will see you at some point for my next video where I do a first time read of that book, but I'm going to analyze it like what I've done with all of my rereads of the rest of the series. So, I'm so excited to get into that one. I'm really excited. So anyways, I'll see you for that one. Other than that, as always, but I've been bad about saying, but I'm going to say it for this video. If you have any thoughts on this book that you'd love to share with me, I would really love to read them in the comments. I think it's super fun to compare the way that we like interpret books and how we have similar interpretations or maybe different interpretations. And I think this book in particular had a lot of stuff that we could probably interpret a little differently. So if you had any thoughts, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And yeah, I have yapped so much in this video. Thank you for sticking with me. If you did, I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'll see you for Sunrise on the Reaping. Bye.